the sacred bondage between two people who love each other. Whether religiously motivated or secular, it's a tradition as old as civilization itself, with virtually every major civilization on Earth having some form of institution of marriage. Our gleaming socialist paradise North Korea, of course, is no exception to this. Simply Googling North Korean weddings reveals a plethora of happy couples tying the knot with their significant others with the expectation of a happy life united as one. However, there is one specific trait that is omnipresent in all of these wedding photos, and that is the ethnic background of the couples in question. In every instance, both the bride and the groom are Korean. So, this naturally leads to the question, do interracial marriages exist in North Korea? Are they even legal? Before we can begin to tackle this question, we must first understand a specific part of North Korea's omnipresent ideology, Juche. It is a common misconception, even for people who have a vested interest in North Korea, to think that because they operate under a socialist model, that they must be racially tolerant and thus approve of interracial marriages like the Soviets did. However, as I said in my video on Bergasati, it's important to understand that North Korea and the USSR are not one and the same. In fact, Kim Il-sung's Juche ideology was developed specifically to differentiate North Korea from its Soviet counterparts. Without going into too much detail, as that's a video in of itself, North Korea's Juche ideology, unlike every other communist society, places a heavy emphasis on the purity of the Korean race. According to the book The Cleanest Race by Brian Myers, Kim Il-sung's Juche ideology was founded not on the principles of Marxism, but rather based on Japanese fascism with a heavy racial element. Juche is centered around the idea of Koreans being the cleanest race that should never become corrupted by foreign blood. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, North Koreans were constantly bombarded by racist propaganda, including radio broadcasts that told of US troops raping South Korean women and corrupting their pure bloodline. So, with this in mind, what information can we find about interracial marriages in North Korea? According to the book North of the DMZ by Dr. Andrei Lankoff, in the 1940s and 50s, as many as 1,800 North Koreans studied abroad in the USSR. During this time, they were free to interact with the locals, and many North Korean men and women wound up with Russian or other ethnic spouses during their stay overseas. He goes on to say that in meeting with these former spouses of North Koreans, they described being in complete shock at the cultural differences between the DPRK and USSR, and often were at odds with their Korean in-laws who were fiercely patriarchal and openly racist towards them, as they were seen as polluting their national bloodline. Despite this, these couples were able to live relatively decent lives provided they fell in line like everyone else. However, all of this started to change in the 1960s when Kim Il-sung started to distance himself from the USSR and began fiercely promoting the Juche ideology. From this point onwards, mixed-race couples were subject to immense social pressure. Koreans who married foreign spouses found themselves unable to get promoted at work. They also found themselves being forced to relocate from major cities like Pyongyang, Nampo, and Wonsan to remote countryside villages as consequences for betraying their pure race. Eventually, things came to a head when foreign spouses were forced to leave with their children or face deportation, and by the late 1960s, almost none of them remained in North Korea. From this point on, interracial marriages in North Korea became all but impossible, with just the suspicion of North Koreans abroad engaging in promiscuity with someone from another race, resulting in their immediate recall to North Korea in shame. Women who became pregnant with the babies of foreign men were allegedly, and I want to stress that, allegedly, forced to have abortions in order to save their ethnic bloodline. However, this should not spell doom and gloom for all interracial marriages in North Korea, as even inside a totalitarian ethno-state, love finds a way. In one particularly famous case, in the 1970s, a Vietnamese man attending Kim Il-sung University in North Korea met and fell in love with a Korean woman named Yi Young-hee. The two were smitten with each other, and the Vietnamese man promised to marry her. However, they soon found out that it was impossible. The Vietnamese man ultimately had to return to Vietnam with the promise that he would return to marry her someday. For 30 long years, he pressed and pressed the North Korean embassy to allow him to return to marry his northern sweetheart. However, they continued to deny his request, saying that Young Hui had remarried and later that she had died. The man never gave up hope, however, and returned to North Korea many years later only to discover that not only was she still alive, but she was still single as well. The two would reunite and finally be allowed to marry in 2002, more than 30 years after they'd met, at the personal request of the then president of Vietnam to Kim Jong-il himself. The two were married in Hanoi in a state wedding ceremony and continue to live together in Vietnam to this day. Another interesting story is that of, and excuse me if I mispronounce this, Gatot Wilotito, an Indonesian national who was studying in North Korea when a massive purge of communist sympathizers began in 1965. Being unable to return to Indonesia without risking his life, he was allowed to stay in the DPRK and eventually graduated from university and took a position at the Kim Chek University of Technology. During his 40-year life in North Korea, he eventually married a North Korean woman and had 3 children with her. But Jesse, I hear you ask, what about in more recent times? Is it possible to marry a North Korean under Kim Jong-un's regime? Well, fear not, my thirsty followers, I was just getting to that. In an article written by Jae-sun for North Korean News titled "Can Foreigners Marry North Koreans?", author Jae-sun explains that while he is unaware of what the legal processes, if any, are for a foreign national to marry a North Korean citizen, he explains that it is legal for ethnic Chinese who are living in North Korea, called Hwagyo, to marry ethnic Koreans. This comes with the caveat that even if the Chinese person also holds citizenship with the PRC, his or her North Korean spouse will never be able to apply for Chinese citizenship or immigrate to China, meaning that the couple will have to stay in North Korea if they wish to be together, as North Korea does not recognize dual citizenship. Hwagyo are able to retain their PRC citizenship due to a technicality. Interestingly, Jae-sun goes on to say that while he never personally saw North Koreans married to anyone other than Koreans or ethnic Chinese, he encountered many mixed-race children in his hometown. Many were half white or half black as a result of North Korean women who worked as receptionists or maids at hotels becoming pregnant by the foreign guests. Jae-sun adds that these children were extremely popular in North Korea because of their exotic looks, and they were perceived to be more intelligent, of a stronger build, as well as more kind than ordinary Koreans, and as a result they became highly desirable spouses for ordinary North Koreans. The North Korean government apparently loved mixed kids as well, as they would often try to recruit them as actors or athletes. Joseph Dresnock's children are prime examples of this, both being actors in various North Korean films. And while one of his children allegedly said that he didn't want to marry a North Korean woman, the other is already married with children. The article does not mention whether or not it is possible for these mixed-race kids to marry ordinary North Koreans. However, given the affinity they receive by both ordinary North Koreans as well as the government, it is likely that they are able to do so. In another article written by Kim Yu-sung for North Korean News titled "How North Koreans View Mixed Marriages," author Yu-sung answers a question as to whether or not North Koreans would approve of the questioner's marriage, being American married to a Chinese woman. Yu-sung answers that likely most Koreans would not approve, citing that North Koreans have a deep disdain for both Americans and Chinese that goes back decades. However, she adds that although most North Koreans over the age of 50 would not approve, a surprising majority of young North Koreans do not subscribe to the idea of only marrying within your ethnic group. She goes on, citing that even when she was in North Korea, she always had approved of interracial relationships, and thought of race as just a creation by rulers so that they could control people, which is spot on. Adding that many young North Koreans think that race or nationality shouldn't be an obstacle to someone you love, and that if they fell in love with someone of a different race, that they should be able to marry and start a family together. It is also worth mentioning that in the latest iteration of North Korea's criminal code, there is no language that specifically addresses or prohibits interracial marriage or marriage to a foreign national, with the only laws addressing marriage being unlawful breakup of a marriage by a third party, aka cheating, as well as marriage fraud. So what are we to make of interracial and international marriages in North Korea? While we don't have any legal documentation that could provide us with a definitive answer, the research we've gathered so far tells us that while it's highly unlikely you will ever be in a situation where it would even be possible, that should the stars align in such a way, it does appear to be legal, at least now. As we see from the two stories of people who successfully married North Koreans, as well as the testimonies from defectors saying that attitudes towards miscegenation have changed over the years. If there's anything to take away from all this, it's that despite the fact that North Koreans have been subjugated to decades of racist propaganda deriding foreigners as inferior, North Koreans are people just like you and me. There is no such thing as race. We are all members of a human race. As such, they too have their preferences and cannot control who they find attractive and fall in love with. We are all human beings, and therefore we all have the potential to be attracted to one another. We are literally genetically hardwired by nature to seek out others for the purpose of reproduction. And as the timeless saying goes, where there's a will, there's a way. I'm Jesse from North Korean Movie Reviews, and I'll see you next time, and in the meantime, I hope you all have a great day.